Amazing. So, Dr. Sam Mcleod, we've been chatting lots about ADHD in sport, but would you give us a little bit about your background and how it is that you work with athletes who have ADHD?
Okay, it was sort of a roundabout, really, because I don't think I started off that way, but I was crossing between health psychology, clinical health psychology, and sports psychology, and that's what my PhD was in. And then through my practice, I run a group practice. I tended to work with young people, so I got a lot of young, talented, and gifted and creative kids and I kind of was seeing the neurodiversity in that for performers all around. So then I went after my PhD a couple of years later, I went and did a master's in gifted education. And so I specialize in gifted psychology, so across the board, so not just athletes. And in that, the prevalence of neurodiversity is quite high. So that's where I kind of learnt all about the very high IQ with neurodiversity, very talented performers with neurodiversity. And then in my consultancy work, working with elite and professional teams, I kind of, if I'd had that at the start of my career, I would have been able to see it much more than I did. And I feel like even some of my earliest clients, I can look back now and see it. So it's kind of gone through there. And my training was always in, because I did health psychology, kind of neuroscience. So it was on the physiological, the biochemistry and the brain. And we had a lot more about brain development in it. So I was always fascinated with that. And that's kind of why neurodiversity makes sense to me now. Yeah.
You make such a good point there. I look back at I've been working with athletes now for about 10 years. And I look back at some of those I worked with early on and I'm like, oh, if only I'd have known what I know now, I could have been so much more helpful
Yes.
to them because
Yeah.
you look back and you're like, oh my goodness, it was clear you had ADHD or you had hypermobility or you had these
Yes.
elements we could have helped so differently with if I'd have been better educated. Um,
Yeah.
so and I'm really interested. You're in Australia. Um,
Yes.
how how does the training work there for neurodiversity? Because in the UK, as sports
Yeah.
psychologists, we're taught nothing.
Yes.
It's all kind of realizing that it's an important area and you need to go and upskill yourself. How does it work in Australia?
Yeah. I was putting an article together and I kind of gave the background of in Australia how all our undergrad and postgrad courses, all the specializations except for really neuropsychology, really don't have a lot of it in their training. So, you might know what the diagnosis is, but to actually treat it or understand the brain chemistry of all the neurodiversity, let alone just ADHD, it really wasn't there. And I think that's why I said I stumbled into it, because I've always been interested in the neuroscience and it's kind of came through there. And now I'm in professional sport. The prevalence in professional sport is quite high because they're really good athletes and usually have found school challenging for the way it's been taught. It doesn't mean that they weren't capable, but they saw themselves as kind of athletes. So really isn't a lot of training in this country. Um, I've been running PD for a lot of the psychs. I do a lot of supervision of psychs in this country who work with national teams or professional teams. And so we're kind of doing it ad hoc. If the Australian Institute of Sport wants some or the Victorian Institute of Sport, I'm kind of running PDs. And that's why I was so happy to find all these other people and we run a book and around the world that, yes, it's
Brilliant.
becoming, so that's, yeah, yeah.
Cool. I'm really interested. You used the word treat there about treating people. And I think there's this whole debate and a real interest around, are we treating or are we helping someone to adapt to a world that's not designed with their brain in mind? And I saw a really interesting article the other day about should the second D stand for deficit or should it stand
Yes.
for difference when we're talking about ADHD?
Yeah,
What's your view on that?
I definitely, I even hate referring to it like that because I do think it's different minds. Levicki wrote a beautiful book called Different Minds, and it was on it had chapters of gifted children and adults, and each chapter was on a different chapter of neurodiversity. A gifted person with ADHD, a gifted person with ADHD, and she called it different minds. And I loved that because I actually think, particularly working in that area of giftedness, when there's so many kind of intelligences and the way the brain works, I find them not particularly ADHD. I don't see it as a deficit. I see it as, how do we get the environment to match the way they see the world and experience it? And it's so rich. It's not really, yeah. And I think even for, some of these people that I'm seeing now, professional, they might be in their mid-20s and they didn't even know, right? They had no idea. So it's their first experience of it. And in professional sport, the first stigma is, oh, is there something wrong with them and they won't be able to learn? And I think that's my mission, really, is to help, organizations, teams, coaches understand, no, this isn't about not being able to learn. And some of them are extremely intelligent and talented across the board. It's about not just that person changing, it's about the coach and the relationship between them and the organization developing as well. We should all be developing in elite sport.
Amazing. Why do you think there are so many good athletes with ADHD or other neurodivergence?
Well, I see it kind of in three ways, like particularly ADHD, I think, and ASD a little bit, but ADHD, particularly if they're hyperactive, they're inclined towards being physically active, and their mothers, when I talk to them, always say that they really were, right? And so exercise is a good way of channeling that. So I think that that's what's happened. And then through school, I think because of the learning challenges that they have when it's mainly verbal and rote kind of learning, they feel inclined to what they're good at. And if they're good at sport, they see that that's going to be their career. That's what they're going to do, rather than be academic, even though that isn't true. And a lot of the professional athletes I work with now are going back to study now that they understand how they work and how they learn. And then there is, kind of the upside of ADHD, the stuff that makes them really good at sport, their creativity and their ability to kind of deal with chaos and pressure, and do that at very fast reaction speed, to take risks, to cause havoc. There's lots of things that make them really good. And even in team sports, and I've just seen the energy they bring and the enthusiasm and how they can change the momentum of a game. So there's, it was interesting for some of the first conversations I had when I came in to one of the clubs. They got a bit confronted because I was assessing every player that came into the club, and I saw many of them who had ADHD, had never been assessed. And each time I went into the room with the coaches, they were scared because they were like, not another one, not another one. But I was like, you're picking really good ones. This is why you keep, because they suit this sport, they suit what you're doing, and you're going to find more of them. So now they kind of refer the first five I identified, they called them the famous five, they flipped it completely. It was like, they're actually right, they had amazing strengths. And also, once they learn kind of how to regulate their emotions and their arousal, I found them really interesting to work with as a sports psych, because most of the time people are trying to calm people down to play sport, but that arousal level sort of doesn't suit someone with ADHD. It's more about kind of the clarity that they might need, or the concentration and the composure, but they usually like to be high energy, and the arousal works for them. So it's kind of, it's interesting for me to work with that as well, which is quite
Really?
enjoyable. Yeah.
Yeah, such a good point. One of the questions I've been asked a lot when I've been promoting the book is, are there specific sports that suit athletes with ADHD more? And
Mm.
I guess my answer is always what's going to suit an athlete the most is something they're passionate about, because the motivation comes from that challenge and that passion. And so if we kind of gave someone a list of here's 6 sports that might suit you because you're ADHD and they're not interested in those, they're just going to drop out.
Yeah,
But I'm curious from your work, particularly working across lots of sports at a very high
yeah.
level, do you see any sports where you see ADHD athletes doing really, really well?
Well, it's really fascinating because I think comparing individual sports and the athletes I know in those, um, compared to team sports, there are some athletes that would struggle maybe with team sports that are better suited to some individual sports, but I suspect they're probably dually neurodiverse. I think, which is quite common. It's not just ADHD on its own. Um, Most ADHD athletes, if they know, they really like team sports. They really like the energy of the all together when you win. They like the highs of it, that dopamine rush. And I agree, if they're passionate about it, the motivation stays for them. It's much easier, particularly if they're not medicated. In professional sport, they can burn out quite a bit and hit that dopamine low. So I think it's really important for them to be passionate. But I've also seen um, individual sports like combat sports, which is really lovely because the way they talk about it and the energy and the flow of their energy and how they can be in sync with they're not fighting against, they're moving in flow. And I find that ADHD athletes can get the conditions of flow quite easily. So I've found it in like boxing and sports with rhythms.
Yeah.
Yeah, rhythms to it. Um, but I do know that if they were, if they were also on the spectrum, there might be better sports for them. Not necessarily, I don't think it's a sport, it's individual and team sport, so I might see the difference.
Do you see any differences in kind of being able to learn and adapt skills within a sport? So um, I work a lot in endurance sports, so runners, cyclists, swimmers. We have a few skills, but most of it
Yeah.
is going fast as you can in a straight line or up a big hill.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I'm always intrigued when we talk about motor skills sometimes being affected by ADHD, and learning in different ways, whether
Yes.
skills that are much more technical. So I also work a lot in, I guess, tennis or golf, where there's a lot of technique elements and where the
Yes.
threat system can have a big impact on their
Yeah.
performance. Do you see
Yeah.
any differences between those kind of skills or those kind of sports with the skills
Yeah.
involved?
It's interesting. I actually think if they can get the information in the right way, like if the coaches are using visual spatial learning or kinesthetic learning or even just kind of drawing so they get the visual of the creative stuff, they can learn the skills really well quicker with the repetition of that than they would if it's kind of in the team meetings. I see them in the team meetings trying to learn stuff and it doesn't work as well. But walking and talking with coaches for the hyperactive athletes, they seem to be able to take in the information better. I use walking and talking with them to try and get them to visualize. But one of the things I have noticed with ADHD athletes, because they're sensory kind of, they're very sensitive and sensory. They often talk about how it feels or how they like to feel. And I think the balance is they kind of honor the feelings a lot. If they don't feel good or they don't feel high, they worry that their performance isn't going to be good. And so the balance between focusing on a skill and how to learn that skill and their feeling and putting it together is really important. We can't take away that sensory stuff, but they also need to learn how to use their brains to perfect the skill. So it's kind of that balance.
So interesting. There was a girl I interviewed in the book who is now a rugby player, but she actually started off as a shot putter.
Oh,
And
okay.
she was talking about, she said, the relationship between her and her coach, from an outside perspective, you wouldn't have seen how they got on so well. She was like an 18-year-old, and I think he was 79 and had been doing athletics forever. And she said, but he got her. And so instead of trying to explain certain movement patterns, he would draw them on the ground in chalk so she
Yes.
could see where to do certain things. And the
Yeah.
fact that he had taken the time to understand her and figure out how to get working best for her gave her an amazing feeling of connection. And the
Yes.
fact that he had figured out, and so that she knew when to, I know, let go of the shot put because she could see the mark on the ground.
Yes.
She just talked so warmly about that coach in
Mm.
such a different way, and I'd really loved what she was doing in that work
Yes.
because of that coaching. It ties in together that skills development and that sensory feeling.
Yes. And also, I think, like even grown men that I have worked with who, maybe in their late 20s, 30s, when they find the way to learn and you work with the coach and the coach does that, the difference it makes to them, the penny just drops. And they have almost been in tears at the feeling of being seen and understood, and that it's not that they can't learn or they're uncoachable, but actually that this person has found the way in. So it is beautiful to see when coaches, I think the best coaches are the ones who are developing at the same rate as their athletes and trying different ways. And I've said even the coaches do a lot of drawing on whiteboards, and but I've said to them that to use their motor patterns of learning and kinesthetic learning more by them moving the magnets on the board and them drawing after you've shown them is more powerful and more likely to be retained than watching you draw it. And so even I can see as I walk past, it's wonderful to see they're drawing their structures and they're doing it, and they're not necessarily taking notes or words. It's just using the combination of the learning styles and layering them so that they
Amazing.
get the
Yeah.
repetition. Yeah. And I love that story of that guy. You wouldn't think with the age difference in the generation of how old school coaching was.
Yeah. And you could see when I interviewed her, just her face lit up. And you're like, that's what you want from a coach. That when you think of your coach, your face lights up because you've got that connection. And
Yeah.
yeah, it
It's
was lovely.
beautiful.
Uh, Coming on to then the coaching element, if you're going into a team and you're assessing athletes, and then you go to the coaches and saying, right, I think there's probably some neurodiversity to be found within this or this athlete. Do you ever work kind of separately from that, where you're seeing an athlete, and often, I mean, I don't think I've ever had an athlete that's come to me and said, I think I might have ADHD, can you help?
Yeah.
The athletes come to me because they've got performance anxiety, their perfectionism is massively overriding, and they are unable to perform as well in competition as they are in training, and they're wondering why there's this big disconnect, or
Yes.
they're just losing it on the
Yeah.
pitch and they're the one getting the red cards. And it's usually one of those two issues that someone comes, and then as I'm working with them, I'm going, hang on, there's a lot of ADHD traits, or I'll mention something and somebody will go, oh yeah, someone has mentioned that in the past.
Yeah.
That might be going on. And occasionally someone's had no idea. We've talked about it and they've chosen to go and see someone to get assessed. And then they come back 3-4 months later and go, yeah, okay, that makes so much sense.
Yes.
Um, and then we talk about, well, how do you want to share that with your coach? And
Mm.
actually, one of the harshest stories in the book was where one of the athletes said, I I chose to come out to my coach, as in like I'm having to tell my coach I've got
Oh,
ADHD, and it felt like a really big thing to have to
yeah.
disclose this. In fact, they used the word disclose as if
Wow.
it's something bad or shameful in any way, right? And so
Yeah.
they said I got brave enough. I went to talk to my coach about it, and they kind of just shrugged their shoulders and went, oh, okay. And it was never
Yeah.
spoken of again. But nothing
Yeah.
changed either. And
Yes.
I'm wondering if you ever have to advise athletes on how to go about that process, and now when I work with an athlete and their coach, they're not sure how their coach will take it. We work on something called a communications passport.
Yeah.
And it'll be like, right, next time you see your coach, these are the things. And we'll do a sheet of paper so they don't even have to say it out loud. This is
Yeah.
what works best for me. This is how
Yeah.
you could get the best out of me. How can I get the best from you? It's a two-way process. Um,
Yes.
and and that feels like quite a nice route to go. But I'm wondering what you use.
Yeah, it's probably in different teams, there's different approaches. Like some of the athletes have wanted to get the full neuropsych cognitive assessment so they can understand their strengths and get it validated. Some have kind of gone, oh yeah, like you said, yep, that actually sounds like me, makes sense. Wants to maybe look at medication because the ADHD is very strong. They can barely sit still. It's very hard to learn. And then others are more interested in the coaching side of it, the strategies and things like that. So it would depend, if it was a full neuropsych assessment, then I'm probably helping them with that discussion as to why with the coaches first. I also have little meetings with the coach and the athlete. So I bring them in together so they can explain to them, similar to what you said then, like, basically this is the way I learn. These are good strategies for me. This is what I've learned about myself. So they can hear that from the athlete, and then ask any other questions, because I do find that even if you go and tell most coaches, it is so foreign. It's foreign to psychologists who haven't been trained in it, that they do just go, oh yeah, because they don't really know what it means. So they go, well, thanks for telling me. But they don't realize that you actually have to
Yeah,
change the way you're coaching, and that it isn't that this person doesn't understand. It will be easy. So if I have a meeting, I can give them lots of examples of what I've used with that athlete, even just from a sports psych point of view, that have worked, either acquired a skill that they couldn't get or reduced their performance anxiety, all of these things. So the coach can kind of ask questions then, what kind of things could I learn? So I've done that. Some have some have been so almost wrapped that they know that there's something, because they've always known they've had learning issues, right? That they kind of go and tell everyone, like, I have ADHD, I have ADHD, and nobody knows what it means. But I kind of, I've even, say if there's captains or leaders, I've tried to educate them. But I think even with all the work that I've done, there still is hardly any psychoeducation for coaches in coaching programs. But even when they're in the organization, they don't really know how to change it fundamentally for the whole program. They're kind of doing it athlete to athlete rather than, no, okay, here's ADHD. Here is kind of a template for these kind of athletes.
yes.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is when I've been doing workshops and conferences and speeches, kind of help promote the book, every single time at least one coach has come up to me afterwards and went, you just described me. And
Yes.
that's really enlightening too, because obviously we're talking about the athletes who have ADHD.
Yes.
But if you're a good athlete and you love your sport, and sport has been your safe place because it supported the traits that you have and you could thrive in it, a
Yeah.
lot of those athletes are going to go into coaching.
Yeah.
And so obviously, and my book focused on the athletes, but there's going to be a lot of coaches with ADHD
Yeah.
too. And so they need to adapt their coaching for neurotypical athletes and their
And for themselves.
neurodivergent athletes, and for themselves to be able to really understand, well, how do I coach in a way that works
Yeah.
for my brain? Um,
Yeah.
so
And
yeah,
it's
it's been really
interesting
interesting on
because
that side.
you think of the demands, like I always see if it's a late diagnosis, like for athletes, it's when the demands in their life get higher that cognitively they get really tired. They kind of burn out. If they have families, they're professional athletes, they're studying, there's a lot going on. And I've actually seen in coaches, of either Olympic coaches or professional coaches, that when their family starts to grow and the demands get higher, I can see how cognitively tired they're getting. And
Yeah,
coaches do an enormous amount of work. I mean, sometimes I think, oh my goodness, it's like they own, like they're the CEO of the business, because that's how they are. They're available 24/7. They're doing, learning stuff all the time, a lot of vision. So it is massive, and they haven't learnt how to actually regulate their own emotions to take that information in the right way. And what I've found is that if I'm at a place long enough and they've seen enough athletes come through with ADHD, the coaches, a bit like how you see it when a child's diagnosed and then the parent goes, "Oh, I think that's me." The coaches start to say, "I think I might be, when I think about what you're teaching and what you're telling me to work with this guy, that's me. That would work with me." So then they get intrigued. And I think, how lovely would that be? Like if you could get all the coaches identifying themselves and then working with athletes that they would understand better. That would be amazing.
Always joked about, I mean, there's lots of debate in the UK at the moment about why is there this explosion of ADHD diagnoses. And I was talking to a practitioner recently who said, "Yeah, I've got 11,000 people on my waiting list for diagnosis." And I went, "In the UK?" She went, "No, in Birmingham," which is one city. And I think at the moment, the latest figures were something like 550,000 people on the waiting list for diagnosis. So it's a huge area. And then there's lots of debate about, well, why? And it's like, well, usually because when you diagnose one person in a family, you're going to diagnose at least one other, which is usually a parent. And probably a parent has gone, "Well, I didn't see what's different about this child. They're just like me." And you're like, "Yeah, those traits are your traits, but that's what may have made some of those difficulties show up in your life." And I'm guessing in sport too, some of the coaches are going to go, I really resonate with that kid, or that athlete. That makes sense.
Yes.
One of the things when I'm not necessarily at elite level, because at elite level, a coach doesn't have so many athletes to work with. They can have that time to get to know them and to adapt their coaching more easily. But when you're working with, say, PE teachers in schools, or you're working with community coaches, some of them have said to me, like, "This is all well and good, and I totally understand it, and I know why we need to do it. But I've got 100 kids on a Saturday that I'm coaching. I haven't got capacity to adapt to the 15 that might have ADHD. Like, how do I do this?" Which is a really good point. But I'm wondering if there are a couple of kind of adaptations or ways of working that you have seen specifically that you've asked them to input for those with ADHD that actually work for every athlete really well.
Well, really, I would see it through the lens of most of the stuff you would design trainings for an ADHD athlete, everyone else would probably love, because it's diversity, it's competition and playing and creating, letting them be creative, and it's visual and it's spatial and it's kinesthetic. It's not stand there and talk to people for 20 minutes and go out there and do something. All of the things that we would want to keep the dopamine up for ADHD in recreational community sport is what we want to do, because we want to keep them engaged in sport for a long period of time. So that, for coaches, I think to do your drills in the same way, thinking that it's only this 15 doesn't really make sense, particularly most people doing sport who aren't at an elite level are doing it because they want to enjoy it. They're doing it with their friends. It makes them feel like they belong. It's a fun thing. And one of the greatest motivators for ADHD athletes is fun. When they stop having fun or that high of that stuff, that it makes it very hard. So I think it's more about coaches recognizing the cohort and why we want them to stay in sport. And even if you're the most elite, if you're a world champion, they're still doing their sport at 60 years of age because they love it, right? They haven't burnt out, and that it hasn't become just about competitiveness and the boring routine drills you do. You've got to mix it up. So I would love it if everyone, sort of said, let's coach to that 15, because it would probably be enjoyable and for everyone.
Love it. And one of the other things we're seeing over here a lot is women between about 45 and 55-year-olds getting diagnosed, probably because of the I can't remember the phrase you used, but it was a really nice phrase. When the demands get higher, and you
Yes.
think someone at that age range, you've got the demands of children growing up, you've probably got parents, you're also looking after a sandwich generation, you're then going into perimenopause, you've probably got
Yeah.
quite a senior role at work. It's like everything, all of those demands push
Yes.
you in, and then you start to realize that this is actually very, very difficult, and maybe it shouldn't be, not that it shouldn't be so difficult, but it's that there might be traits that are making it more difficult for you because you're trying to work in a world that's not designed with your brain in mind.
Yes.
And one of the things that I see works so well for that group is sport, because
Yeah.
sport is the dopamine and it's the social element and it's that sense of achievement. I host a podcast with a friend of mine called Annie Emerson. She's a former triathlete, and she still commentates at a lot of big triathlons. And there was a big one last weekend. She said it was amazing. 47% of the people racing were females. And she said so many of them were kind of older females that looked utterly terrified before they went and got in the water. And 2 hours later, they were crossing the finish line, so proud of themselves and
Yeah.
so excited for what they'd been able to do.
Yeah.
And I think if we can keep sport fun, but with that sense of achievement and not the competition against others, but competition
No.
against ourselves, the challenge and the novelty that ADHD feeds can be really beneficial. So I love your concept of it
Yes.
needs to be throughout life.
Yeah, it does. I've actually seen that kind of cohort. Like I've seen Olympians, multiple Olympics, have children. They've become executives. They're still involved in sport, but they kind of disconnected from it because as a woman, they've got all these other demands to look after the home and be good at their work and provide as well and do this and that. So they disconnected from sport, even though they were at the top in their country. And the ADHD that hasn't been diagnosed, you see the symptoms come through like much more strongly until we can get them back into the routine and back into sport. And then they see that it actually manages it and probably managed it well into perimenopause for some of these older athletes who are still competing until they stopped. And so it is a therapy, but it's also about their own identity and belonging to something and seeing what they can do and you know realizing how therapeutic sport was to them through their whole careers, which is probably why they were diagnosed late.
Yes. There
Yes.
was a mum I interviewed in the book whose daughter is a netball player. And it was her daughter that did all the research and then came to her mum at about the age of 15 and said, I think this is why I feel different. I think this is why I'm struggling. And her mum was diagnosed afterwards too. But her mum said she can see how netball self-medicated her. And prior to
Yes.
that, she was a swimmer and she phenomenal athlete. But she could just see the self-medication that sport had been to help regulate. And I guess it's the final area I'd like to ask you about is that you said when you can help them regulate their emotions,
Yes.
particularly prior to going into a competition, with that clarity and with that composure, then actually their traits can be phenomenally helpful.
Yes. Yes.
How do you help athletes with ADHD regulate their emotions?
I mean, there's strategies that I would help them learn, which is kind of using their strengths, their sensory strengths, to monitoring their body and their arousal more regularly, almost getting to the point that it's automatic so that they can discern. Because what I find with ADHD athletes is because they can't regulate, they say they're all right. You can check in and they go, yeah, I'm all right, I'm all right, I'm all right. And then they're not. Completely
Yes.
weird. Yeah, so kind of discerning or that gradient that they go on. A lot of them would say that they were kind of more out of control as kids than they are now as adults because they didn't like how out of control they used to get. So we use kind of body monitoring, stress arousal monitoring, control breathing techniques, just emotional techniques. So kind of using emotional intelligence to try and translate what's happening physically into emotions. But what I've actually found with a lot of ADHD athletes, they might have performance anxiety, but often it's kind of that balance. They're kind of not in harmony because however they're living their life outside of their sport isn't kind of giving them the right kind of arousal level to just go and play their sport. And if I find they're overthinking and they get judgmental of themselves and critical of themselves, is because something else is out of kilter. And so actually trying to get them to regulate everything. If they're doing well at school, at sport, they're often so tired and fatigued that their home life, it's chaotic. They're fighting with their partner. They never clean up. They forget everything. They lose their phone. So it's kind of managing all of that better to get them functioning and get routine and structure and reminder systems and downtime. Sport, particularly elite and professional sport, is very extroverted. They don't get a lot of space to down-regulate, but they crave it. If they don't get it, they want to hide away and switch their phone off for weeks and nobody speak to them. So they won't text. They've lost their motivation to text anybody, seen as rude, but actually they've crashed. So I think it's the whole kind of system that they're in to try and manage it, as well as their individual strategies that they might have, which could be different for, depends what their strengths are.
That is super helpful to start thinking more about, actually, if somebody seems overly focused and they're overthinking about their sport, as sports psychs, I know that's the area I tend to zoom in on. But
Yes.
thinking about how do we make them feel safer outside of their sport and more in control in the rest of their life means that they will be in a better place to be able to perform really well on the pitch or the course. Amazing.
Yes. Yeah. Because one of the reasons why they don't want to take meds sometimes is because they feel like they lose their intuition. They know they have this innate, ability to anticipate and read the flow of some sports. They think the med takes that away. It doesn't, but they think that. So
Okay.
so if I always say to them, we need to do all of your thinking and your problem solving outside, whether it's the pitch, the field, whatever, they're on the court, in the pool, all of your thinking is done outside. We've done repetition. We've got the information in so that you can just trust it and use that intuition. And when some of them are getting really fatigued, that real critical voice comes out. They get very negative about their performances. That's kind of an indicator to me they're overwhelmed now, and we need to and see what's happening. And it'll usually be an area in their life that's gone awry, that has just put them over the edge. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. I've learnt lots. This is amazing.
That was lovely.
And really lots of really, really helpful things, I think, for coaches to understand, particularly that idea that if you are trying to structure your sessions for those with ADHD, everyone will benefit.
Yes. Yeah, everyone will be having fun. They'll think they're super coaches.
If anyone watching this would like to get in touch or learn more about your work, how can they do so?
It's probably easiest via email, I suppose. Yeah, so my email address is S for Sam and then Mcleod, MCLEOD, at samcentre.com.au. I think you might have my email so they can go through that way if that's easier.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Rosie, it was lovely to see you face to face. Yeah.
Yes. Cheers.
Okay. Bye.